Hello and welcome to Between the Lines, the podcast where we unpack the stories shaping APAC's reinsurance markets. I'm Mithun Varkey, Editor-in-Chief of InsuranceAsia News, and I'm thrilled to bring you this brand new fortnightly series. This is a different sort of podcast to what you might be used to. We are going to start each episode by bringing you into one of our editorial meetings here in our newsroom. You'll hear me and my team of reporters break down the key stories and events shaping the reinsurance markets, and you'll hear what trends and stories we're tracking across the region. Plus, we'll bring you exclusive insights from industry leaders on the hottest topics in the region's reinsurance sector. It'll come as no surprise to you that the hottest topic right now can be summed up in two words: Trump and tariffs. So welcome aboard, and let's dive between the lines. I'm joined by Deputy Editor Andrew Mullen and Special Projects Editor Kristina Shperlik. Andrew, Kristina, welcome.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you're as excited as I am to kickstart our podcasting careers.
We are very excited.
Definitely looking to get forward to get started.
So, last week was deadline for the all-important April 1 reinsurance renewals. Let's start with that. 1/4 is obviously one of the most important renewals for us in the region. 60% of our region's treaties renewing, and nearly all of Japanese treaties as well. I think the key takeaway is that we are in a softening market. Rates are coming down across all lines of businesses, especially property cat. What's most notable is that reinsurers now have record levels of capital and has been posting very healthy ROEs. The impact of California wildfire losses, though substantial, with the latest estimates near US $40 billion, haven't had much impact on the renewals, despite the exposures that Japanese and Korean carriers had to it. On the property renewal side, we've seen that the Japanese market has had a benign cat year. They've seen double-digit reductions and improved pricing for previously challenging areas like per-risk covers, as cedents capitalized on reinsurer growth ambitions. Results in Korea, which has been struggling over the past few years, has improved, which meant treaties renewing in Korea, so 15 to 20% reductions as well. In India, the reintroduction of minimum pricing for property covers are expected to correct underlying rates and improve treaty performance. So, Kristina, what are your impressions of the casualty renewals? Did PFAS exclusions find more legs in the region?
So definitely casualty is as competitive as other lines, and we saw double-digit reductions for excess of loss pricing. Talking about PFAS, so this is interesting. First time ever we saw discussions in South Korea. And we also saw some discussions in Japan, similar to previous years. So far, we haven't seen any broad exclusions. It's because insurers have already put significant efforts to reducing limits and repricing. So they don't want to be exposed to US casualty that much. Many insurers now want to have automatic inclusion of US exposures in their portfolios, and some reinsurers had to agree to that because the market remains very competitive.
Andrew, you've been looking into the specialty lines. What do you have for us?
So, in terms of India, there's a growing demand for specialty lines. We're looking at cyber, surety, agriculture and health. And in terms of the overall picture, aviation rates are being flat. Marine and energy programs have seen minimal changes due to manageable downstream losses and new capacity. And just speaking of aviation, there was a few lines in some of the 1/4 renewal reports. To a couple of the big companies talking about aviation, and then we had a story just in this week. Gallagher Specialty talking about aviation. Now, aviation has been in the news for the last several months with some high-profile crashes, some high-profile losses, and even just last week we had a helicopter crash in Japan, which made the news as well. And in their report, Gallagher Specialty said that storm clouds are on the horizon for the aviation sector, and it's delicately balanced. There's quite some strong language in their report, and they highlighted these major losses in the recent months, adding pressure for insurers. Even internally, they flagged that the senior management within these companies are pushing people to find solutions to this. They made it clear that capacity is almost the key driver of setting the market pricing, and they also mentioned how one of the key market players exiting the industry has kind of put the cat amongst the pigeons a little bit, and that is Swiss Re Corso. So their concerns whether this will be just an isolated exit for one company or it's going to spread to the broader market.
Kristina, to bring you back, one of the hottest topics this renewals was India's collateral requirements for cross-border reinsurers. How did that play out?
So how it works, reinsurers can choose whether they want to keep premium reserves in India or they want to issue a letter of credit. Most of them went for keeping premium reserves in India because of cost considerations, so letters of credit are expensive. We are also seeing collateral requirements are affecting facultative reinsurance, pricing and capacity, but not that much treaty. In general, something that we've said in the past is that administrative burden and compliance because of collaterals is pretty high, so some cross-border insurers could consider exiting India market completely. At the same time, we know that some foreign reinsurers, they want to set up a branch in Gift City. And for example, we saw Peak Re have set up a branch recently.
I think the consensus seems to be that these favorable conditions that we saw in 1-1, further softening at 1-4 will continue well into mid-year renewals, supported by ample reinsurance capacity. One thing for us in the region is that limits purchased have been lower or flat, both at 1-1 and 1-4. Things are unlikely to be different mid-year as well. So reinsurers in the region will need new ideas to drive growth. Moving on from renewals, two big stories in the past week were from Southeast Asia, an earthquake in Myanmar, which even hit Bangkok, as we've all seen the video, and a pipeline fire in Malaysia. Kristina, you've been speaking to your sources in Kuala Lumpur about the pipeline fire. What can you tell us?
So in general, it was a quite significant event. More than 300 people have been injured, and more than 300 buildings and 300 vehicles have been damaged as well. And we just got the latest numbers on the repair costs. So I think it would cost around hundreds of thousands of dollars per property. Damage varies from minor, like shattered glass, to big structural damage.
So, Kristina, having read your story, we know that the event is covered by Petronas' captive Energas, but they have reduced their insurance limits from 80 million Malaysian ringgit last year to 40 million this year. And the explosion could cost Petronas Gas around 4 to 5 million. That's repair costs, revenue loss, public compensation, and also the reputational damage from this accident. What does that mean for the reinsurance program as a whole?
The most interesting bit here is that we know that Petronas has multiple programs, and two of their main programs have just been renewed a few days before the event. So this includes two programs, one big for main generating or processing assets and one smaller program for non-generating units. From my understanding, the event will be covered by the smaller program for the non-main units. At the same time, the program this year is designed to be partially proportional and partially non-proportional. So the reinsurers sitting after the captive retention, they would be hit, but not as hard because they're protected by the captive retention. At the same time, reinsurers on the proportional side would have to pay the loss up to the limit. Andrew, you mentioned my story, but you did a story on Thailand. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes, I mean, the story was on Thailand, but it actually stemmed from the earthquake in Myanmar. The event actually struck in Myanmar, but the insured losses are mainly going to be from Thailand. There's not as much cover in Myanmar. There's not as many buildings there, but the buildings in Bangkok, such a developed city, we've all seen the videos of the spectacular collapse of the high-rise building which was being built. We've also seen the videos of the people running from the pools and things like that. But from an insurance angle, the building collapse caught our attention particularly. This was a building that was completed, or that the construction of the shell was completed at some point last year, but it hadn't been finished yet. It was meant for a government organization. And in terms of insurance, these claims could exceed 1 billion Thai baht, which is around $29 million US. An interesting thing that's come out in the wake of this event is that previously earthquake coverage was just kind of wrapped into policies. It was kind of a freebie given away by insurers. But what they're saying now is people may still have to start buying earthquake cover separately. They may remove this free element. And that's because these increasing risk of these seismic event has prompted this move. So consumers may need to seek this additional coverage. But what they're saying is that Thailand's disaster profile does remain stable, but it's just heightened the awareness for consumers and companies regarding the importance of having that adequate coverage. But what's been highlighted a lot is that the overall risk assessment has not changed despite this earthquake.
That's quite interesting. I mean, one thing that caught my attention, a report by Moody's about earthquake risks in cities that are not in the fault line. I think they mentioned Singapore and some cities in China, as well as, potential cities that could see impacts from earthquakes elsewhere. Those are the key events in the past week. Looking forward, what's in the agenda? What's keeping you guys busy?
So I have two big stories this week. One is about silent AI, another one is about regulatory landscape in Australia. I'll just quickly explain what is silent AI. It means that AI-related risks are unintentionally covered and underwriters are not aware of that. So this is not that big of a concern in the Asia-Pacific region right now. It is way bigger in Europe and in the US, but insurers are watching this space. So the most interesting thing here is whether AI usage qualifies as professional services. There could be arguments around that. So insurers may argue that it doesn't, unless explicitly stated, and it could lead to disputes. So it means there could be some work done on the wordings and on the contracts in general. Also, I think, from my understanding, silent AI cover could affect all lines, but mostly it is a challenge for casualty, professional indemnity, and errors and omissions specifically.
And what's happening in Australian regulatory landscape?
In Australia, financial accountability regime just kicked in. It now includes general insurers. Specifically, it holds senior executives and directors accountable for customer outcomes and compliance with regulations. So now it means that senior officers, they must understand their responsibilities very clearly. They need to map out specific tasks and ensure that if things go wrong, accountability falls on the right people. Also now the executive pay is linked to long-term performance and customer satisfaction, which means that bonuses could get delayed or adjusted if regulations are met. And as always, similar to what we've been saying happening with IFRS 17, smaller companies may struggle to keep up. Larger firms are still better prepared. Another important regulation that is coming in Australia is around mergers and acquisitions. The new merger control guidelines from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission are expected to increase transparency and efficiency in the approval process for deals. I haven't written this story yet, but I'm talking to people around it and I'm watching this space.
The Australian regulators are always busy, and it's always important for us to keep watching what they're doing, especially as the country goes into general elections in a couple of weeks. Talking about politics, we're recording a week after what Trump called Liberation Day. He's announced sweeping tariffs across the world. Andrew, you've been tracking Trump.
Yeah, like with his first term, he keeps dropping bombshells and he keeps providing us headlines, keeps providing us stories. So we all know that he dropped the bombshell last week about 10% tariffs on the world and very high tariffs up to 50% on select countries. He then came out again and upped the tariff on China. That tariff took effect. The tariffs across the world took effect. But then late at night in Washington, he decided to change his mind. So he took to his Truth social media platform and announced a 90-day pause on tariffs above 10%. But this does not include China, Canada, Mexico. This was less than 12 hours after the new tariffs had started. But Trump seems to have taken offense that Beijing has vowed to respond to Trump's tariff move, and Trump has now raised the tariff on China to 125%, which Trump says is due to a lack of respect that Beijing has shown to the world's market. The 90-day pause for everyone else comes after about 75 countries called various US departments to ask for negotiations. So that 90 days will take us up to about the start of July. So it's about 3 months. But anything could happen in those 3 months. So we've seen anything could happen in a few hours. So that still leaves people wondering, and especially for our concerns, insurers, what the impact will be for their business. Just a few days ago, Aon's head of credit solutions for Asia, Steve Taylor, had already touched on the issue when he said that tariffs could see firms turn to trade credit insurance to grow existing and new buyer relations, aid credit management, decision-making and secure lending facilities amid a rising probability of company defaults. So it's already in the minds of the insurers. But let's not forget these tariffs are on top of the port fees Trump has already threatened against vessels which have connections to China. This could mean a $1.5 million port call fee per visit for a Chinese ship. This has already caught the attention of the P&I clubs, and they're already thinking about that. So there's a lot of thinking and a lot going on, and we just need to watch this space and see how it all impacts the global market and especially insurers.
So yes, I think people are still trying to make sense of all the decisions coming out from the US administration. We're going to hear a lot more on that topic from our special feature interview with Head of Shipping for Aeon, Oliver Miloschewsky. Oliver, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Mithun.
Let's start with the broad implications and economic impacts of Trump's new tariffs.
So, key implication in my view is really all about economic uncertainty. And the real question in my mind is how business will respond to this uncertainty, to complex and ongoing change. So, as far as change is concerned, I think we also have to bear in mind tariffs is just one piece of the puzzle when you look at the logistics and maritime sector. So we are looking at ongoing conflict in the Red Sea, vessels being rerouted around the Cape. We are looking at climate change-induced low water levels at the Panama Canal. There may or may not be changes in terms of ownership of the Panama Canal. And probably the biggest one is that the potential impact, if the administration imposes that, changes to port use for Chinese flagged, owned and managed vessels calling at US ports. So tariffs and the change that tariffs will bring, I think we'll always have to look at in conjunction with everything else that's playing out. And that's a very complex and an ongoing change. So as far as I know, that there's no playbook. There are no economic models that would tell businesses or economies how to respond, which strategies to implement. So it's really all about preparedness, about businesses looking forward, looking at the risk management, looking at their strategy, and ultimately robust decision-making in the context of that. So what we're doing, we're actively working with clients on the risk assessment. We are using data-driven supply chain risk assessment tools to really prepare them for change that may come so that they can in the best possible way, respond to threats, but also to capitalize on opportunities.
Like you said, it's a perfect storm of challenges for businesses in the region, and it's quite and there is no playbook. One thing that we've all been trying to understand is what's the immediate impact for insurers? How do these decisions impact insurers?
So the insurance industry is, it enables growth and trade. So to a degree, insurance, and in particular marine insurance, is directly dependent on global trade, on economic activity. So when we look at change, the Red Sea, for example, is just one example where it's relatively easy to assess the impact not only on shipping companies, but also consequently on insurance. So we've seen a large number of losses in the Red Sea. We've seen war breach premiums reducing because vessels are being rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope. And we've also seen more remote impact, like the loss of the Ultra Galaxy that grounded off South Africa. So very significant loss activity. And that's a little bit more direct. That's easier to assess. As far as tariffs are concerned, I think that's a lot more complex. So we may be looking at changes in terms of exports. They may be affected in terms of value and volume. Economic activity could impact vessel values, vessel utilization, which as a consequence would impact marine insurance as well. And on the positive side, we may see that increased levels of risk and uncertainty ultimately lead to a greater take-up of insurance. So I think that there are a whole range of scenarios that we're really dependent on economic activity. And I think once that becomes clearer, the impact of tariffs on businesses, on economic activity, that will give us some clues what the impact on insurance will be.
So what will be the impact on supply chains? Last time around we saw that companies were introducing a China plus one strategy where they were moving some of their production to other countries around the region as part of its efforts to reach out to the US. How do you see that changing now that Trump hasn't spared any country in the region?
Yeah, so reshoring China plus one has been a topic for quite some time already. I think COVID has seen quite a few changes in supply chain. Other conflicts have led to changes where really businesses and even countries looked at single point dependencies and were looking to diversify, for example, dependence in terms of trade, but also in terms of energy supply, in terms of information supply. So I think what we're seeing now is just a continuation of that theme, where really businesses are looking at the risk management. They look at diversification. How dependent are we on a particular country as an export market? How dependent are we in terms of the supply of parts or products and services? So I think that China plus one, that in all likelihood will continue to play out. From an exporter point of view, it could even lead to USA plus one. In terms of the strategic approach, when you think about it, certain countries in Asia, they are very dependent on the US as an export market, in particular some of the smaller economies. So for some of them, it may well make sense over time to diversify, to find other markets other than the US to really help them at company level manage their cash flows, protect their profits, protect their balance sheets.
That's quite interesting. So USA plus one, as in you're building a market beyond USA.
Building a market beyond USA. So some of those statistics are read smaller countries like Cambodia, like Laos. I think up to 40% of their GDP is directly dependent on US business. So from a risk point of view, that is obviously something that they will need to address, or that they may address simply to protect themselves in the future from further changes.
Interesting. That means not just China, some of the other regional economies will also be looking to decouple, so to speak, from the US.
To decouple, I think it could also mean that countries are looking again to offshore. So when you look at the differentials in tariffs, does it make sense for a country to, again, offshore business to another low-tariff country? I think there are all these questions that business will have to run through in the risk assessment to see what makes sense to reshore again in terms of diversifying, protecting our supply chain. And does it also make sense to offshore again to capitalize on tariff differentials?
So companies will look to capitalize on tariff differentials in the coming days, and that would shift supply chains massively.
I think it's one of the options. Right. So I think at present it's really all about establishing different scenarios and then operationalizing those scenarios. How could that play out in future? What does make sense from an economic point of view? What does make sense from a supply chain point of view?
You were mentioning that during COVID, we saw supply chains shift. And also during Trump's first administration, we had tariffs on China, which forced companies to sort of adapt. What have we learned from that experience, and how do you think that will help us?
So tariffs are an interesting one, as in they're really easy to impose, but the effects tend to be very long term. So going back in history, going back in time, we've seen the infamous chicken tax implemented 1964, and to the best of my knowledge, that is still in place. Okay. Imposed at the time by the US administration on chicken exports to Europe. And we've seen the same with the 2018-2020 tariffs implemented by the US administration at the time. So interestingly, these were not rolled back by the subsequent administration. So what happens quite often is once tariffs are in place, they will stay in place, and they will stay in place in all likelihood for quite some time. I think in terms of lessons learned out of that period, it's really, again, how business adapt to change. So businesses adjusted accordingly to previous tariffs, whether it's export markets, whether it's supply chain. And I think it's those kind of lessons that are really invaluable when they now look at the tariffs that are coming into force now.
So companies should learn to adapt, and the tariffs are likely to be in place, and it's unlikely that they'll get rolled back by the upcoming or the next administration.
That's certainly one of the scenarios. So, and I think, as we commented on earlier, so tariffs are really just one of a large number of changes.
Yes.
And I think the rate of change and the complexity just becomes increasingly higher. So, which is really why it comes down to how do businesses respond, and at a macro level, how do economies, how do countries respond to these changes?
We've been talking about tariffs, but there's something equally important, perhaps even bigger. The Trump administration is considering imposing port call fees on Chinese vessels. Oliver, can you give us some insights into that?
Yes, that's certainly another example of a change that's which ship owners and the logistics industry potentially faces. So these increased port dues, they've not been put into place as yet, but they've been flagged as something that may be implemented further down the track. As I understand it, that has potentially very far-reaching consequences of a very significant increase in cost for any Chinese-owned, flagged, managed vessel that calls at any of the US ports, facing increased charges in excess of $1 million. So, and the impact of that is potentially quite significant, not only from a cost point of view, and obviously those costs being ultimately passed on to consumers. So it may affect a large number of shipping companies. So even companies that are not based in China, but shipping companies owning Chinese-built vessels will then have to reassess how they utilize those vessels. So yes, over and above tariffs, let's see yet another example that may significantly impact the maritime industry.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you very much for your time. Like all things with Trump, I think this will play out in the coming months and years. So we'll keep an eye out.
Thank you very much for having me, Mithun.
That's all for our first episode of Between the Lines. We're pretty happy with it so far, but we'd like to hear what you think. Reach out to us on LinkedIn or find us at InsuranceAsiaNews.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our daily and weekly newsletters. I'm Mithun Varkey. Thanks for listening. See you in a fortnight.